Yes? Can you hear me? I can't hear any of you.
Yes, we hear you.
All right, all right. I like it that way. Yeah, that's good. All right, well, welcome everyone. If you don't know what's going on here, that's probably a good posture to be in. The premise is non-duality, and what that infers is a negation of what we're taking to be so, and how we perceive what we're taking to be so. It's in a dualistic manner. So there's duality, which is subject, object, yes, no, act, react, this, that, high, low. And then there's the dualism of the subject, object, where we're standing or sitting or walking around. The sense of being a subject at one moment and an object at another goes on continually. It's kept in the dark by this identification as the body. So we see ourselves as a singular thing, but the activity of that self, this feeling of being the doer and the thinker and this and that, is a dualistic event. Yes? So you can be definitely assured that there's seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching. Yes? It doesn't take much observation. Does it? Just nod your head a little bit. Give me a yes. So let's agree on their seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching. Now, how is that seeing met? Is the seeing met as a seer? And then the emphasis is on what's seen, and the emphasis stays on the seer seeing, the seer seeing, and in a way is forgetting the activity of seeing, yes? So basically the activity of seeing is claimed by some other activity, and that activity, a mental one in nature, implies the seeing means there's a seer, yeah? And now suddenly the seer is what's seeing the seen. And the seer is this act of being identified as this long-lasting, independent, separate entity. Right underneath that, the basic premise of non-duality is being ourselves reality. So basically, being ourselves reality, it behooves us, or it just behooves, whatever, to look at what we're not. By seeing what we're not, there's a sense of what you are in just the seeing of what you're not. And so the noun has a different feeling than a verb. It just does. And that's what will happen. You'll sort of go, there'll be that sense of nounness will weaken, and you'll start feeling like you're in activity in a way. That which is seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching, but can never be seen, felt, tasted, touched, or known. Thank God, because if it could, that would mean there is something else that we are, but we're not. We are that, being ourselves reality. And as I wanted to read something here, a simple story from Ramana Maharshi from one of his books. The cover's ripped off, so I don't know which one. But it's a simple little statement. It says, again, a woman wore a necklace around her neck, but forgot it. She began to search for it and made inquiries. A friend of hers, finding out what she was looking for, pointed out the necklace around the seeker's neck. She felt it with her hands and was happy. Did she get the necklace anew? No. Here again, ignorance caused the grief of thinking she lost it, and now she feels joy in the knowledge of finding it. But she had never lost it or found it, yes? It's always there at all times, no matter where you are or what you're thinking or what's going on. That is that. This is the absoluteness of non-duality, is that being ourselves reality it makes no sense to look for reality. You know, if you don't agree with that, then keep looking for reality, and that project will fail terribly, and you'll realize it by the failure of the systems you're relying on. The great wisdom of no escape is realizing there's nothing to escape from, yes? The great liberation is from the need to be liberated, yeah? The great shift isn't a profound psychic shift, it's a loss of interest, really, basically. There's a loss of interest in that which you're not, yeah? And all the interest that is being claimed to imply it's you that's interested in it. You being interested in the truth is the blindness to the truth, yes? It's just that simple. Now, if you don't agree, there's tons of other probably workshops on this channel, or go anywhere, and you can sign up, and you can get better, yeah? You can convince yourself that something's happening. And maybe it'll work a lot better than nothing. But if you're sick and tired of looking for what can't be found, and you're sick and tired of blaming yourself for the failure of a system that's not reliable, yeah? It wasn't because, or it isn't because you haven't done enough, yeah? It isn't that you should have kissed each toe of that guru's feet. It isn't that you should have made another rotation around the statue. It isn't. There's no volition involved, yeah? You are what you're looking for is the premise of non-duality. Yeah. It doesn't call you to arms. It's very disarming. I mean, for me, it's like an incredible rest. You don't really know when you're identified with one of the wheels that is spinning, that the wheels are spinning. You just don't see it, yeah? It's just like the fish doesn't know it's in water because it's always in water. Well, this is sort of the same thing, and the interest in this topic has its value until you hear the topic, yeah? Then there's no need for interest in it anymore. It's either true or not, you know? It's that simple. If, you know, I feel humbly that we're all awake, we are awakeness, and here in the dreaming we can seem to be awake to that, which means it can appear to us as what we're not, that we're awake to that, or it can appear to us as what we're not, that we're not awake to that. It doesn't change the fact of awakeness. It just doesn't, yeah? So traveling lighter is if you're awake to that fact. Traveling heavy is you're not seemingly awake to that fact. But the fact is a fact is a fact, yeah? So, so study about what you're not. See if the main movement of the mental activity, which is in time, first of all, the main movement is what you would call an act of claiming. So something that is happening is used to claim that there's someone or something it's happening to, yeah? It's just that simple. Now, what we get confused with is we feel like something's happening. That's not what we're negating. We're not negating seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching. You know, we're negating the one who thinks they're seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching. That's all. And the negation isn't even necessary. The only reason why it's necessary is there's a belief in what we're not. When you see you're not that, there's no need to negate it because it was non-existent to begin with. Yeah? So it's a real weird thing. When you're seemingly in the problem, you need a solution, but the solution is there is no problem. Yeah, so there you go. So as soon as you arrive at the solution, there's no need for it because there was no problem. If you keep milking the solution, it's not going to bring you what you think. Yeah? It's going to reinforce the reality of the problem. I had it one time. I was in the hospital. I don't know where I was. And something, there was like a pause with an exclamation point. And something came over me after the little whack. And it just said, it's always been this way. Yes. It just was so clear that nothing ever really happened here. At least to change the fact of what we're in, that context, yeah? And even though it seemed to be very short amount of time, its impression has been indelible, yes? It left a lasting impression, yet it didn't seem to appear for long, yeah? Only truth does that. I'll tell you the truth. Everything that keeps reinforcing and yapping all day leaves a very, very short impression. That's why it has to keep yapping, to constantly reinforce that weak impression. Something can show itself in a nanosecond and will affect you the rest of your life. Yeah? Because it's not of time, it's not of quantity, it's not of mass, it's not of volume. Yeah. If you're not going to believe in that, what else are you believing other than your head, really? I'm serious. If that isn't enough for an act of being convinced, there must be great faith in the head, in the thought system. There must be, because you can have a miracle and the head forgets it in a half hour, yet it remembers a seeming slight of 40 years. It's an insane, biased head. It's not an objective field of discovery. It already knows. It thinks it knows already. And it's just trying to fit the evidence to the conclusion. Yeah. It's not open to any new conclusion. If you're not involved in it, it's not that interested in it. Yeah, it would love to experience its own absence, but it would want to be there, you see, to have that experience. It wants to become this great idea. It doesn't want to be it. It has no interest in that, but it would like to become it, maybe. Yeah, especially if it takes a real long time. So, yeah. I heard this message a few times. I read a little bit of Ramana Maharshi. I read a book called Who Cares by Ramesh. I had been introduced to Huang Po for a long time when I was younger. But when I read that, I read it in a whole new light. And basically, what I share at these meetings from books I've read, those books were read like 20 years ago. The little sayings are still alive because they promote like an avalanche inside. When I hear, you can't use the Buddha to seek the Buddha, it's just music to my ears, yeah. It is. It's just awesome. And I love whatever can be perceived can't be perceiving. I just love that. Yeah. That shuts a lot of debates down quickly. It shuts a lot of discussions down. How are you going to discuss it? How are you going to discuss that from the basis that what's perceiving is the perceived? If you're at the meeting based on that, you've just been negated by the lovely sword of fucking Huang Po, which is whatever can be perceived cannot be perceiving. That's the whole story of my life. Yeah, I take that which can be perceived, Paul, as being the perceiving. Yeah. Why would you want to go to the branches if there's the root available? Why would you want to dance on those leaves if the root's available? See if it lands or not, and if it does, don't think about it. Yeah? Or when there's thought about it, see it's not you. Yeah? What's sniffing around the message isn't you. It's what you're not. It's trying to see if you can get an advantage out of it. And maybe it'll even go to great lengths and try to be a non-self as a self. But basically, what you are isn't interested in what it is. It is that. Yeah, that frees its interest to go a lot of other places and non-places, yes? Because it's not looking for itself. It's not busy in looking for itself. Yeah? So seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching suddenly get replaced with see or seen, hear or heard, tasted. What is that but duality? Yes? Yes or no? That's it. So there it is. Something's going on. Seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching. There's no duality in sight, so to speak. Then there's an activity, and suddenly the seeking gets completely underemphasized, and now there's an interpretation of the seer seen, which is a dualistic binary narration, yes? That's what non-duality is negating. Non-duality is negating the er from the ing, yeah? So seeing, yes, seer, hearing, yes, hearer, yeah, yeah. And then the warnings show up. One of the warnings is this. If you sit down at a meeting about dreaming and you're hearing it as the dreamt, it's not going anywhere, really. Yeah? But if in that meaning about dreaming, you hear it as the dreaming, yeah, and you hear that the message is about the dreamt and you're not that, that has value, yeah? But if the dreamt is hearing that it's the dreaming, it's going to go to, I should have 50 Rolls Royces, beautiful babes, or my private jet, good joints, stuff like that. If you hear it from the dreaming, there's an acceptance of whatever the hell's going on. Yes? Doesn't mean a passivity to it, but an acceptance as the starting point. And maybe you're called to action, maybe you're not. But there's an acceptance of what's going on. Not an initial denial of it, but an acceptance of it. Yeah? Yeah. Now, did that change down the road, or does it change at the basic point? Seeing yourself as the dreaming instead of the dreamt changes the effects that you experience throughout the day. Yeah? You're not the dreamt as the dreaming. There is no dreamt. Yeah? Dreamt is an appearance in the dreaming, and there's really no dreaming, but we're using this term to infer something. So there's the dreaming, and then there's the dreamt. Most of us are usually in the act of being identified as the dreamt. For the dreamt to get knowledge, the greatest knowledge the dreamt can get is the failure of the dreamt. Yes? The impossibility of the dreamt ever getting it. That's probably its highest form of understanding. Yeah? Yeah. It usually comes a little bit of a rush before it of futility and really being bummed out. And you can't believe how much of your life is held up by interest and shit. And so when that interest gets withdrawn, you feel sort of lost in the sea of whatever. But that's a temporary drowning of what you're not, yes? You're going to buoy right up and you're going to be getting into the flow. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's no death of an ego because there isn't one. But there is a certain sense of disillusionment and futility that ends up in a hallelujah, yeah? Because you finally realize you can't get out of what you're not in, yes? It's beautiful. So I hope that's confusing you more, and we'll just open up, and if you want to talk, great, yeah.
Paul, I have a question. Could you speak a little bit more about there is no dreaming?
No, there's no dreamt.
Oh, I thought you said there was no dreaming either.
No. There's dreaming, there's no dreamt.
Okay, I misheard, yes.
Yeah.
No, Paul, you did say that there's no actual dreaming.
Well, I said I don't want to go there,
You
but
didn't want to go there, yeah.
yeah. Well, let's in this thing. Let's just talk as a description of what's happening in our daily event. Let's call it dreaming. Yeah. Blame the Course in Miracles if you don't like it, but I sort of like that view. Yeah. Is there dreaming? That's suspect also, but no, let's not jump that zoom. Yeah. So in this, there's dreaming. I'm saying there's no dreamt. The dreamt is an idea. It's sort of a noun. It's sort of misreading a verb and calling it a noun, basically. That's what happens. Yeah. So the dreamt, I just seen it over the years. It doesn't go anywhere. Yeah. Just to keep talking to the dreamt about not being the dreamt. It just doesn't go anywhere because the only way the dreamt can hold anything is as the dreamt. Yes? You have to question the system. Yeah? I've seen it. I've talked to so many people, seemingly, and then I realized early on that I gotta, that's why we put out so much information. We're trying to, like overwhelm the system so you can't get it because we'll keep throwing it so that it gets frozen and then there you are, yeah? And then there's a recognition that you're not that, which is trying to get this message, yes? It's beautiful. So this is the point. The point is this idea of being the dreamt can't get it. It doesn't, it's above its pay scale. So it's pointless to talk about there is no world to that which thinks it's in a world. It doesn't go anywhere. Let's just see you're not that which thinks it's in a world. Let's not say there's no world. Let's go, there's not that thinks there is in a world. What? Yeah. Let the world be as whatever it is. But let's question who is it or what is it that's here? Yeah. Is it a mental activity? Is an act of being identified as a mental idea? Is that really the starting point that we mostly receive and give things from? I believe it is, yes. Is there something before that? Is there something before the thought of being the doer, the feeler, the taster, the toucher, the smeller? Yes, there is. What's that? You're never going to know. Why? Because you are that. Yeah? Isn't it simple? Why do you think you can't understand it? Why is it indescribable? Yeah. Because you are it. Yeah. You can't get a good look at yourself because you're all that which is looking. Yeah. You can't write out a description of what you are because you're busy being it. Yeah. If you could see something else, you could describe it. You could say it's 6 feet on Wednesday, 7 feet on Thursday, likes people with long hair on Mondays, Tuesdays, it's a little grumpy. You'd be able to describe it, but you are it, yes? You're beyond all understanding and knowledge. You're in the sense of, or the state of being it. Yeah. And then just live the life of the action figure. Yeah, get on with it. Maybe lower your standards and lower your goals instead of complete transcendence and entering the 15th dimension, finding a nice pair of pants or something. Yeah? Keep it simple. Get a recipe for a gluten-free cheesecake. Yeah? You can succeed in these things. And now all that interest that was going into this reinforcing of what you're not now is the sense of presence you feel, not in certain controlled conditions and environments, but wherever you are. Yeah? It's not brought about by a peaceful location. It may be amplified, but wherever you are, it's available at all times, right where you are, with no requirement necessary. Yeah. being ourselves reality. If that's not the case and you believe it's different, then that's not non-duality. It's another topic. It's another interest. Yeah? So, anyone else?
Yes, Paul, there's a question on the chat board. I'll read it out loud. Is it fair to admit the mind experiences some lower vibrations once it realizes this and tries to then use it to entice? Seeing of that lifts the vibration. Pretty soon, it's all pretty funny. Or is this thinking just mind level too, and only blank mind is reality?
Will you say that again? Can you say,
It's also on the chat board if you want to reference it, but I will read it again. Is it fair to admit the mind experiences some lower vibrations
who's
once it
experiencing
realizes?
vibrations?
When you read it from the beginning,
But who's experiencing lower vibrations?
Audrey, would you like to? I think this was
Hi,
Audrey.
sorry. Okay, so that was in reference to something you were talking about, and I can't even remember what it was either, but basically the happening was that whatever this experience is was in this sort of lower level sleepy haze, not really wanting to do much but sleep. And that was fine, just allowed that happening. And then it's because the mind realized, like, well, there's really no point there. It's all like, it's all just circular and it's all repeating itself. Everything, every single moment is a repetition. And so then it felt low, and then it felt it was all funny. And then it's like, well, now I'm thinking, or who's thinking? What are these thoughts? So is this just the spinning? And only in this point of that blank mind, and that's experienced, which can happen quickly, is that the reality then? Because
No.
it just seems it's all just
The reality hasn't gone anywhere whatsoever while those experiences are being attended. Yeah? The blank mind you're talking about may be sort of a free sample or a glimmer, but it's not, in essence, it's not, there's nothing different. All those other experiences, yeah, are they're in the context of what reality is, yes? So one
yes,
is
yes.
reality or is reality. The blank isn't reality and the others aren't. Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
So, yeah. But it's nice to linger when it's funny. So you might as well, that's a nice little, you know, that's a nice room to sit down in. Yeah. And then there's the thinking about it. But see, it does the thinking and everything has no effect. What has an effect, seemingly, is when it's you thinking. Yeah. So the thinking is not the target in a way. We speak of the thinker, which is a thought in and of itself. It's a thought that doesn't see itself as a thought. It sees all other things as thoughts, but it doesn't. But it's the idea of the thinker is a big influence in what you're experiencing or perceiving or taking to be so. So when you question that, yeah, the differences between lower frequency and higher frequencies become less important, let's say, because there's sort of an infinite baseline that overrides all the different shifts in frequencies, I'd say. Yeah. If I've lost you, Audrey, thank you.
There's also another question by Stephen. Is there a perceiver? Is there a dreamer? Is there a thinker?
No. There's an appearance, but it's not so. Yeah. If you don't, who's to say listening or not listening to Wang Po, maybe read him a little and come to feel like where he's talking from is pretty cool. And then maybe just take what he says and let it lay there and see what it kicks up. Whatever can be perceived cannot be perceiving. It's very clear, very simple. And it's nice to allow it to be, it's almost like putting a float in a very agitated surface. And it stays still and see what it brings up out of the agitation, yeah? I mean, the whole narrative in one's head is based on the premise that the perceived is what's perceiving, yes? The narrative of Glenda or Paul or Alan, its basic premise is what's perceiving is what's perceived, yeah? I'm the one who's conscious. When you say I'm consciousness, it's framed as a body. That's what's saying it. You think you're saying it as consciousness, but you can't grok consciousness. Everything that's said and noticed and noted here is framed with a body identification. That's how it goes. Yeah? Yeah. So when someone says all I am is consciousness, it's being said out of a frame of a body. It is. Yeah? I had it once with the Course. I felt like I've had centralized the problem, which was body identification. And I love the lesson, which is you're not a body, you're free because you're just as God created me, whatever, something like that. So I used to sort of chant that. And then one day I realized all the chanting was reinforcing the body. It wasn't relieving me of the body, because it was the body thinking it was chanting I'm not a body. And I couldn't, not one chant could get before that, yes? The feeling of being a body was before any other process I could do to reaffirm I'm not a body. Oops, I guess that's a failed system. So, yeah. Isn't that a drag when you're thinking you're doing something and it produces the exact opposite effect you were looking for? It happens quite a lot. Because this ignorant view is quite stubborn. It doesn't learn. It doesn't. Self doesn't learn. It can't get out of self. It does not. It does not. It keeps on, the mental state keeps on trying to get out of itself as itself. It does. That's why there should be a spiritual bureau of yay or nay. So when people are signing up for a 30th retreat, it could be reviewed and someone could say, no, like a soup Nazi, no more retreats for you. It's not being of service. You cannot attend another retreat. But spirituality doesn't have that, yeah? No one breaks into a spiritual meeting and performs an intervention on the spiritual seeker, which they should, really. Don't grab that DVD. Put that picture down. Drop that book. Drop that calendar. You're not going anywhere. Don't you see it in a lot of ways? Everything here can be used, and the mental state tends to rush there and say it got there first, and then it uses what you think is for one purpose for another purpose. Yeah, and it has a very specific one purpose it reinforces, and that the idea that it's you. That's what it's doing all day. Yeah, no matter what you're doing, no matter how different the activity, the claiming of it has the same purpose, which is to imply that you're the doer of whatever you're doing, even non-doing. You're the doer of that. Yeah. If you don't see it, you're going to be looking from it. Yes. Not seeing it doesn't make it so. It's an activity that's going on. It's not volitional. You can vow not to do it, and it will continue. You can swear on a stack of Bibles you're never going to do it again, and whoops, it will be doing itself. Yeah, there's no volition involved. It's a recognition from what you are. You see it, and in that seeing it, that's the end of your job. Yeah, like Ramana said, there's a certain point you arrive at where you put the ball down and grace takes over. Really, yeah. I would say we're at that moment every moment, really. Just put the ball down and let grace take over. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else?
Mike has his hand up.
Mike. Which Mike? Mike.
Me, Mike.
Mike.
Me.
Yes.
I was just going to mention along the lines of funny, one of our Saturday satsangs, and it was nice outside in Marin. I remember you brought up how there's that delaying tactic. So certainly like heavy spirituality, but even like us going to satsang, in our non-duality talks, that which realizes it doesn't want to end isn't going to rush there. Right? It has to have, it's going to find this weird little balance. But it struck me at the same time, that's what made sense to me of what the Course in Miracles said about that God's will is that there be happier dreaming before waking up. But of course, that was very annoying, right? Some God would dictate that. But then it meshed with what you said, that there's no separate other will to say what I'm going to do. So yeah, there's going to be this interesting balance of, somewhat delaying, not rushing. That's going to be the traveling lighter. Yeah. And it can be funny, as opposed to the Course in Miracles, which didn't sound funny at the time. So I just thought.
Can I read something for you here? Can I read something from Ramana on that point? It says here, the present difficulty, the present one, like right now, yeah? The present difficulty is that man thinks that he is the doer, yeah? I don't believe man thinks that he is the doer. I think there's thinking that there's a man thinks that he is the doer. Yeah, I don't think a man is thinking. I think there's thinking about a man, yes? But it is a mistake. It is the higher power which does everything, and man is only a tool. Let's say, if he accepts that problem or that position, when it is made to appear to bear the never mind. But he basically says he stressed that attitude quite a lot. Yeah, the idea that we're not the doer. So. In recovery, it's primary. It's a primary point, actually, which is the idea of surrender. The surrender and the absolute state of that, Ramana would say, well, who is there to surrender and to whom? But on one level of the action figure, surrender is probably the highest level it can reach, where it realizes, its whole premise that gives life a meaning that it's ours or yours is that you're the doer. Yeah. So if you're not the doer of it, then whose life would it be anyway? Yeah, well, that's what you find out. Because you're definitely not the doer. Yeah, that's obvious, eh? Obviously. How much shit have you done that you didn't want to do? The doer seems to imply there'd be some power over the doing, wouldn't it? That's the confusion of the mental state. It believes it has power that it doesn't have, because it assumes its logic is, if I'm the thinker of the thoughts should listen to me. Really, aren't they? That's its logic, and it's a failed logic, yeah? So the idea of being a thinker produces a lot of confusion in just noticing what's happening, which is thinking, because you're wondering why they're not going in the direction you were pointing them out to. Because, yeah? So there's tons of evidence, but the stubbornness of the system, this is like the dreamt. To talk to the dreamt about free will, to me, is pointless, because its whole spirit and its manufactured programming is that it has free will. Yeah, so it's going to act as if it does, even if it doesn't. Yeah, it does. So just see that there's no free will from what you are, and then when you think you're going to get a latte and you get a mocha, you'll fucking have a little chuckle around it. Yeah, because you'll see you really basically don't really have a clue what's happening. Seriously.
Are you saying that the programming itself is this belief in free will? Because like
Yeah.
I had something happen today where like YouTube is forcing you now to do two-step verification, and if you don't, you lose the ability as of November 1st to have access to your creator studio, which means no more uploading Paul Hedderman videos if we don't comply. And my initial response was like, how dare they force me to do something that I don't want to do? Maybe I don't want them to have my phone number, you know? And
Yeah.
so there was this upheaval of like, oh my God, I feel so like, I don't know, controlled by the system. And so what you're saying is kind of like the latte thing. Well, it's a mocha. You wanted the vanilla latte, but you got a mocha. Is this the same thing? And I never had control anyways. I never had freedom anyways. The mistaken belief or mistaken program was that I did.
Yes. But the funny thing is, the program doesn't learn. It's not like AI. The program, it will keep on acting out of the assumption you have free will. Even if you've been at a 3-week, you have no free will retreat. The 22nd day, you'll be thinking again, you have free will. Yeah? This is why not. Don't waste time trying to convince the dreamt. Just realize it's a programmable event, and you don't have a program. You are the programming, so to speak, that which you're not. Yes? It's sort of like, you may not like the ride you're on, but you are the ride. You're the biggest ride that thinks it has choice about all the other rides it gets on and off. Yeah? At the ultimate beginning of ride, there's absolutely no choice. So, yeah, I don't care about free will or not. I don't care.
I have another question. In this Awakening Together community, we really practice awareness, watching awareness, the simple, direct means to what one of the teachers calls eternal, infinite bliss and love. And so one of the terms that was thrown around was this thing called awareing, which it's that whole verb again instead of the noun. So instead of thinking awareness as some object, if it's awareing, I was wondering, like, is that like the grace you were talking about earlier when you were mentioning about how just let the grace take over? Is awaring and grace the same thing?
Again, the idea of letting grace take over is after the fact. Grace has taken over. It's always so, yeah. So, but we do the formal. I let grace take over.
You just blew my mind with that. I don't know. It's just something about the way you said that was so, I don't know. It just, wow, my whole body's lit after that.
Oh, good, good. Well, I love a lot of ways people say what they say. I may not agree with their take, but I agree with their artistic presentation, and however it works and helps others, I'm fine with that. I think there's awaring has no trouble with awaring. That's its nature. Yes, it's awaring. So, yeah, yeah.
Do have another question here in the chat. It says, bearing in mind, we can't get out of what we are not in. What did you mean when you told the story about the younger lion realizing he was a lion and not a
Yeah.
sheep when he
Yeah.
saw his reflection in the water after the young lion realizing the truth about himself would come to himself as a sheep dreaming he had a dream he was a lion? That's by Kathy.
No, no. What I'm saying is, here's the young lion sees the reflection of his face and compares it with the reflection of the old lion, and he realizes, yes, yeah, lionhood. Actually, he realizes he's not a sheep. Yeah. Now, he gets up and walks away, and in that period of time of walking away, the mental state, which is the programming of being a sheep, arises and claims that event that happened at the pond, and now the lion, seemingly identified as a sheep, thinks they've had a lion experience, yeah, but as a sheep. Yeah, that's what I mean by that talk. Yeah? So the important thing is not the pond, it's what happens after you leave the pond. Because this happens very fast in time. Haven't you had events like peak experiences or epiphanies, and usually when they ended, it was preceded by a thought, I'm having an incredible epiphany, yeah? Or like you heard that there's a great party, but when you get there, it sucks. That's what it's implying, yes? So the sense of seeing that you're a lion is sort of an experience in the story of a sheep, but you're not experiencing a lion, really. You're not a sheep from the lion, yeah? The lion is a state that's not experienced. It is, yeah? It's your inherent nature. You'd have to be another nature to experience it. So you don't experience it. You experience that you're not a sheep, really, yeah? There's a recognition of what you're not. And then if you have the warnings in place, when that pause gets interrupted by time again, and that assumption that you're a sheep starts to take hold, you can see it from the lion. It goes through its gymnastics, but its effects don't work anymore, yes? The sense of lion holds while there's the identification as the sheep, yes? The identification as the sheep doesn't have to stop because it's mechanical. You see it from the lion, yeah? Yes? So you walk away, the sheep programming reacts like it always does. When it regroups, it tries to claim whatever happened. Now it's saying, I had this incredible peak lion experience as the sheep, but you're not falling for it, yes? You're a lion, you're a lion, you're a lion, you're a lion, yes? Yet the narrative is you're a sheep, you were a sheep, you're going to be a sheep, you were a sheep, you're going to be a sheep, you were a sheep, you're going to be a sheep. But now the present tense, I'm a lion, I'm a lion, I'm a lion, I'm a lion. They're not contrary. One can appear in the other, yes? The lion is of context. The idea of sheep is of content, yes? One doesn't have to be gone for the other, yeah? It's true. It's a mechanical activity. It's not you deciding to take yourself to be a sheep. It's not you. It's mechanical. So you thinking that you've realized you're a lion, you should now not identify as a sheep. But that's not the fact. The fact is there's a programming that reacts, and that's the act of being identified as a sheep. You just don't fall for it, yes? It doesn't mean it stops. It means it doesn't complete its mission because enough of you has refrained, yes? That's grace, let's say. So I thought, just like a lot of people believe, they have to have no thought. They've got to reach a point where there's no thought, or blank mind. That's a fucking thought right there. Yeah? There's a thought that I have to have no thought. What's available right now isn't blocked by thought. Yeah? It's seemingly blocked by my thought, but it's not. It's seemingly, because you think it's you as the thinker, that's sufficient enough to withdraw a lot of attention from the panoramic view and put it into this little myopic view, basically. Yeah. But that can only happen in time and very temporary. And like Mike said, the wish of the Course is that your dream will become happier before you wake up. Yes? Hallelujah. That would be a nice card to send on every holiday. I like that. That would be a very nice side. Yeah. I'm just sharing from how, I don't think about this stuff. I don't. I just show up to the assignments that I'm sort of meant to show up to, and then things happen. Yeah.
Andy has his hand up.
Who?
Andy.
Hi,
Oh,
Paul.
Andy.
You just talked about the panoramic view versus the myopic view. And so if the majority of my life is spent in that myopic view, is practicing is the way to gain, how do I put this, the perspective of the panoramic view, just by practicing, is practicing the way to realize that different perspective of the panoramic view.
Yeah, it's not versus the myopic view. The myopic view appears in a panoramic view. Yeah? Now, the appearance of the myopic view may localize the attention and interest, which is a seeming forgetting of the panoramic view. But you can have a panoramic view and the myopic view at the same time. You're not having it, but it's there, yes? Yeah. So I find all there is the need, or what's necessary is the possibility of these possibilities being available, yes? Now, not as an achievement, but as, they're available. but they're not available through interest. They become more available by a loss of interest in what you're not. Yeah.
So wanting to have that panoramic view is not going to necessarily.
No,
Yeah,
because that's the myopic view that wants the panoramic view.
yeah.
And therefore, the myopic view reinforce itself by wanting the panoramic view. That's how the head works. Yes. So you just notice that and see, wow, I'm in a certain fucking pickle. You know, there's a huge conundrum that I can't seem to get out of, and that's a great place. Yeah, because then you get left with your own devices, and you'll see they're not yours. Yeah, and then there'll be a loss of interest in arriving at where you already are. And then that interest will be not being focused and withheld until you arrive, but it will be readily let go of now, and it will enrich your day. Yeah? Yeah, it'll enrich it.
One of the
Like
things,
I'm looking out a window now, and because there's time, and space, I see about 8 different levels of green. Yeah? It's incredible. All different color levels. One's closer to me than the second one's, and then third, fourth, fifth, and then it goes out to the larger trees. Fucking that's incredible. Yeah? You know, to be able to be open to that with no thought of effort is a pretty good indication of the ship has been stabilized, so to speak. Yeah, whatever's navigating is doing pretty well. Because you're on the deck just watching the show go by. That's pretty nice. Yeah. It's a lot of joys that go unaccounted. You can't. I don't stop and write them down, and my girlfriend doesn't want to hear anymore of my descriptions of the beyond. So basically, it's just comes and goes like everything else, but it's beautiful. Yeah? That's part of the panoramic view. But the panoramic view isn't like a match against the myopic view. Yeah? There seem to be 2 possibilities, but one is appearing in the other. The panoramic view is basically the stock version of what we are. And then there's a there's a rogue version, and which is reinforced by a myopic view. It does. It reinforces itself through contraction, not expansion. It wishes for expansion, but it uses that wish to contract even more into this idea of Paul. Yeah. So you start noticing that, and things start falling into place without much effort. And if there's a call to effort, like in my life, if there's a call for effort, you put out that effort. It's not you, and then the whistle is blown, and now you chill out, and you get to know when it's time to move, and when it's time not to move. You're more. Yeah, I can't describe how different it is from before, but I've had a lot of rocky befores, like drug addiction and shit like that. So the contrast is easy. This is a much subtle traveling. Yeah. But obviously, if you focus on something, it's at the expense of others, right? Like if you focus your eyes on something, it's at the expense of others, isn't it? Yeah. So that's basically the general take. The mental state is focusing attention and interest on this mental idea at the expense of other possibilities. We want to share those possibilities so that those costs can be nulled and voided, yes? You can see the myopic view from the panoramic view. Yeah? And there's humor in it, really. It's hilarious, to tell you the truth. Yeah.
but you can't see the panoramic view from the myopic view.
Of course, no. All you can do is have ideas of it
Yeah.
that are framed as the myopic view. Yeah. So the myopic view gives you its take on the panoramic view, which always includes it in it. That's why it's the myopic view. The panoramic view doesn't have your head in the middle of it. It can't entertain that idea. That's why, they speak about concepts, and the conceptualization is that's like an agitating activity on the surface, yeah, of that clarity. Yes. So you get an idea of what it would be like, but it's mimicked by the system you can only think about everything from. Yeah. So yes. So spirituality at one point, was looking at, you had to be tall and thin with robes, maybe long hair, hopefully blue eyes, speak in a monotone, yeah, move slowly. That guy's spiritual. I mean, that's fucking crazy, yeah? How could we come up with that? Only from a myopic view, obviously. Yeah. So, here's a visitor from the panoramic view. He looks just like I thought. Isn't that funny? Yes. No. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, nice to see you, Andy. Yeah. Come back, Andy. I think this would be helpful to you, these talks. I do.
I've either been at everyone or heard the recording, so
Oh, great.
I'm
Oh,
always.
then you're. Oh, yeah. You're one of my. Oh, yes. Someone just intruded on the house. Oh, yes. Well, nice to see you, Andy. Again. Yeah.
Paul,
You
it
can,
is 5 minutes after.
if you've heard us for a while, how much the message hasn't really changed much, has it?
But I need to hear it over and over.
I know, but at least we've done a good job at not changing it much. Yeah, yeah. I feel that's my one request from the beyond. Yeah, yeah. It's how would you believe that heaviness would bring you to lightness? I just don't see it. Or thought and effort is going to bring you to that which demonstrates no thought or effort. I just don't see it. Doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah. Why at one time it did, but that mental logic to me is incredibly insane if you see it from outside itself. It's an insane logic. Yes? Yeah. So, nice to see you again, Andy. My higher power has arrived. Yes.
Yeah, it's 6 minutes after, so probably that's
Well,
why.
we can go on. Don't worry. Hey,
Oh,
we're all
okay.
right, honey. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm happy to be here.
There was a comment by Stephen. I was moved when you said, put the ball down and let grace take over. But then it feels like there is a me, and he actually capitalizes me, to be putting the ball down. So it's confusing.
Don't worry about it. Just put the ball down. Yeah, really. That second reaction is from the head. Yeah. We're using a language, and just give it some artistic license, and then feel what's really being said. Yes. Grace. I think it's a past tense anyway. Wouldn't you like to live as if that grace has already taken over? Yeah, why not? Why would you want to put it as a future possibility based on you putting the ball down? Basically, putting the ball down is a formality. It's already occurring, yes? Hallelujah. Yeah. But yeah, I met people earlier on who wanted to try to change the language and put it in more, but it's, why? That's too much work, yeah. You gotta like read between the lines and feel into the message. So, yes. There's no one to put the ball down, obviously, and yes, but go ahead. Anyone else on?
Yes, Kathy writes, revisiting the pointing that we cannot get out of what we're not in, everything. As you say, is a presupposition. People, lion, sheeples, and bodies as such, the negation you're calling us to is a presupposition. And if so, how do we get out then? I feel like you already answered that when you said grace has already taken over.
Well, you don't get out because you're not in. That's the point, yeah? You don't get out because you're not in. For you to get out, you have to be in something. If you're not in something, you're in the eternal out, so to speak, yes? That's based, that's all rooted in the assumption or the statement of being ourselves reality. What does that mean? I think it's a very clear description by Ramana. It's a present tense condition, being ourselves reality. Yeah. That's the underlying premise of all non-duality pointing, in a sense, yeah? Being ourselves reality is why, or you can call reality Buddha, being ourselves Buddha is why we can't use the Buddha to seek the Buddha. That's why, yeah? We can't use mind to seek mind because we are mind. We can't use light to seek light because we are light. That's why, yes? It's not like a punishment or you could have if you were good or better, but now you can't because you've been bad. No. The fact is you can't use what you are to look for what you are. It doesn't work. Yeah. He was more rude. He said you can do it for eons and nothing's going to happen. But I think maybe a few years of your life you can come to that same conclusion and be moved on. Yeah. So, yeah. I feel you can actually never spend another second looking for what can't be found. Really. The rest of this life. You can be convinced and be done with a lot of stuff here. You can. Yeah. It's just having the ears to hear and the eyes to see. And I believe we all do. So there you go. That's why we keep showing up and sharing. Yeah. Yeah. Someone talked about feeling like you're being burned and stuff. Those are indications that, yeah, something was done underneath your surveillance already. The observing missed it. That's the beauty. It's a thief in the night. Yes. While you're awareing, it snuck in. And yeah, there you go. Yeah. Anyone else? Hey, Andy, I like that background. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thanks. Well,
Very nice. Yeah.
I just want to repeat something that you said earlier, and this is kind of paraphrasing, but it's given me a lot of food for thought. Awakening isn't a profound psychic shift. It's just a loss of interest.
Yes. Well, it's not an awakening. We are awake. But losing interest in being awake when we already are, losing interest in arriving at where we already are, losing interest in all the ideas that we've separated ourselves from the Godhead and we must work and sacrifice to return, to lose interest in that, to lose interest in the need to be liberated, to lose interest in the next fucking seminar, then lose interest, other than gain interest in Paul Hedderman. That was very healthy for you. But lose interest in this, lose interest in that. Yeah, that's how it demonstrated in this life more. There wasn't a gaining in interest. There was a losing interest, a lot. Yeah. And then the interest and attention, which I never knew, it just could stop and hover. Yeah. And then spend what it needs to spend to live a day, not transcend live a day. And I feel that's the sense of presence that you can sense now. It's just undirected attention and interest. Yeah. It's been called off, so to speak. It's not being sent out on all these chores, and it just rests and you can sense it. It feels like you're alive, yeah. And you're awake now, and you never get gypped. Sleeping, awake, thinking, not thinking, you're always here. Yeah. So, anyone else, hon?
I don't see any more hands
Oh,
or
well, then
anything in the chat.
all right, so let's say goodbye, eh? Can I say goodbye to everyone? Hey, Andy,
Sounds
thank you.
good.
Thank you for hanging out with us all this time. Let's see. Oh, there she is. Saina. Not bad. I've got it finally. After 3 weeks, I didn't forget. That's good. That's progress. We got Connie. Nice to see you, Connie. I think you need to get a bigger clock than the one you have there. It's like, what is that thing in London? Ben, it's huge. John K. Nice to see you, John. It's dark where you are, eh? Mike, it's very dark where you are. Don't take it that way. I was talking about the night. Yeah, yeah. Don't call me up. It's so dark. No. Mike Zerbel, my main man, he does a lot of service. He's the only thing that's keeping Zen Bitch Slap afloat. So, yeah. David B. David, you're looking a little more relaxed than before, yes? The cops aren't breaking in on the door. You're not going to the hospital. Yeah. See, it's simple shit like that. Yeah. It's great. Gratitude is in order. Gratitude. Rhoda, the powerhouse. There's Rhoda. Nice to see you, Rhoda. Are you one of the ones that got me to come here?
I am.
I know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you.
I'm enjoying it. Yes, a lot. I missed it.
Thank you for letting Grace do what it's already doing.
Yeah. Why, well, yeah. All right. Alan, nice. Alan is a crossover. I usually see him at other Zooms. Nice to see you, Alan.
Hey, Paul.
Glenda. Yeah. Glenda. Yes. Good. Let's see. Who else is here? We got, I don't know, Kathy. I don't know. I can't read this stuff. Oh, we got, here she is. Yeah, Kathy there. Nice to see you. Yes? And I can't read it. It starts with an A. I'm looking right at you. She's got some kind of bird on her shoulder. There you go. Yeah.
That's Audrey.
Oh, that's Audrey. Nice to see you, Audrey. We got Stephen and Sue. Sue I'm familiar with. Yeah. Thank you for coming today, and I hope to see you. We'll be there tomorrow. What's today? Tuesday. Tomorrow night, Wednesday, we do our little non-duality act. Come and join us Pacific time. Thursday's recovery. Saturday is non-duality, 1 o'clock, and it's live where I am at Marin City. And then the routine keeps going. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for letting me participate. And awakening together. See you.
Thanks, Paul.